top 10 richest countries in the world. What do people think when they think about the richest countries in the world? And what comes to mind when they think about the smallest nations in the world? Some would be surprised to find out that many of the wealthiest nations are also amongst the tiniest. Some very small and very rich countries, like Luxembourg, Switzerland and Singapore, benefit from having sophisticated financial sectors and tax regimes that help attract foreign investments and professional talent. Others like Qatar, Brunei and the United Arab Emirates have large reserves of hydrocarbons or other lucrative natural resources. Shimmering casinos and hordes of tourists are good for business too. Despite the pandemic restrictions on international travels, Asia's gambling haven Macau remains one of the most affluent states in the world. But what do we mean when we say a country is rich, especially in an era of growing income inequality between the rich and everyone else? While gross domestic product, GDP, measures the value of all goods and services produced in a nation, dividing this output by the number of full-time residents is a better way of determining how rich or poor one country's population is relative to another's. The reason why rich often equals small then becomes clear. These countries' economies are disproportionately large compared to their small populations. Today here in this video we will talk about top 10 most richest countries in the world, so let's get started. 10. Brunei Darussalam. 1,788 rooms, including 257 bathrooms, a banquet hall that can accommodate up to 5,000 guests, a mosque for 1,500 people, an air-conditioned stable for 200 polo ponies, 5 pools and 18 elevators. This is where Hassan al-Bolkiah, the Sultan of Brunei, lives and gets his habitual $20,000 haircut. His fortune, derived from the immense reserves of oil and natural gas of the country, is estimated at about $30 billion, roughly 50 times that of Britain's Queen Elizabeth. Yet, it is not all roses in the Sultanate. Despite the monarch's opulence, and an on-paper per capita purchasing power of about $75,000, malnutrition in Brunei is commonplace. Although data is scarce, it is believed that over one-third of its 450,000-strong population lives in extreme poverty, with scores of others relying on government welfare to get by. Luckily, the country was spared the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic. What it was not spared from was the pandemic-related plunge in oil prices. After registering a 13-year high of 3.8% economic growth in 2019, the GDP fell in 2020 to 1.1% and in negative territory, minus 0.6%, in 2021. Then again, due in large part to the war in Ukraine, oil prices have now largely bounced back, and so have projections for Brunei's economy, which is now expected to grow by 5.8%. 9. United States. Did we say that the richest countries are also the smallest? That is not the case, of course, of the United States, which in 2020, during the early and worst phase of the pandemic but still managed to climb to the top 10 of the list after teetering on its edges for the best part of the last 2 decades. But did Americans truly get richer during the pandemic? It depends on whom you ask. Those in top quintile of the population and earning over $60,000 a year managed in many cases to keep working from home, saw their stock investments grow in value, and received stimulus checks on top of that. Yet, many lost their jobs and businesses, found themselves with astronomical medical bills or other expenses to pay, lined up at food banks. The job market has recovered since then, but inflation at a 40-year high is eating into wages. Yet another story is how the super-rich fared during these years of economic turmoil. Since March 2020 to May 2022, according to Forbes, the collective wealth of America's 727 billionaires leapt by $1.7 trillion during the pandemic. They now hold over 4 times more wealth than the roughly 165 million Americans in society's bottom half. In 1990, the situation was reversed. Billionaires were worth $240 billion and the bottom 50% had $380 billion in combined wealth. In other words, if you are an American and your income is a fraction of the average GDP per capita, it is fair to argue that someone else is probably eating your proverbial lunch. 8. Norway. Since the discovery of large offshore reserves in the late 1960s, Norway's economic engine has been fueled by oil. As Western Europe's top petroleum producer, the country has benefited for decades from rising prices. In the second quarter of that year, the Norwegian fell by 6.3%, the biggest decline in half a century and possibly since World War II. Does it mean that Norwegians have become significantly less wealthy than they were before the pandemic? Certainly not. After the initial shock, the economy gradually pared the losses and closed the year at minus 0.7%. Then, in 2021, it regained much of the ground lost during the previous months, growing overall by almost 4%, the same rate projected by the IMF for 2022, that is before oil prices set new highs following Russian aggression of Ukraine. 7. United Arab Emirates. Agriculture, fishing and trading pearls, these used to be the economic mainstays of this Persian Gulf nation. Then oil was discovered in the 1950s and everything changed. Today, its highly cosmopolitan population enjoy considerable wealth, traditional Islamic architecture mixes with glitzy shopping centers, and workers come from all over the world, lured by tax-free salaries and year-round sunshine, to the extent that only about 20% of the people living in the country are actually locally born. The United Arab Emirates economy is also becoming increasingly diversified. Outside the traditionally dominant hydrocarbon sector, tourism and construction, as well as trade and finance, are major industries. This is not to say that the Emirates were not impacted by the pandemic and the concomitant fall of oil prices. The country, in fact, briefly slipped out of the IMF ranking of the richest countries globally for the first time in decades. 6. Switzerland. White chocolate, the bobsleigh and, of course, the Swiss Army knife. But also the computer mouse, the immersion blender, Velcro and LSD. The list just goes on. These are only some of the inventions that Switzerland has contributed to the world. Today, however, this country of about 8.6 million owes much its wealth to banking and insurance services and to tourism, also to exports such as pharmaceuticals products, gems and precious metals, precision instruments and machinery, from watches to medical apparatuses and computers. Is it really a surprise that Switzerland has the highest density of millionaires in the world? According to the latest global wealth report by Credit Suisse, 14.9% of the adult population owns assets worth more than $1 million. All this money, however, could not shield the Swiss economy from the effects of COVID-19. In 2020 production declined by 2.5%. Yet, things could also have been worse, especially when we consider that in neighboring Italy, Spain, France and Germany the contraction amounted respectively to 8.8%, 10.8%, 7.9% and 4.5%. 5. Macau SAR. Just a few years ago, many were betting that the Las Vegas of Asia was on its way to becoming the richest nation in the world. Formerly a colony of the Portuguese Empire, since the gaming industry was liberalized in 2001, this special administrative region of the People's Republic of China has seen its wealth growing at an astounding pace. With a population just over 600,000, and more than 40 casinos spread over a territory of about 30 square kilometers, this narrow peninsula just south of Hong Kong became a money-making machine. That, at least, until the machine started losing money rather than making it. When COVID struck, global traveling came to a halt, and for a while Macau even slipped out of the 10 richest nations ranking. To this day, Macau is the only country on the list whose per capita purchasing power is lower than it was before the start of the pandemic, about $125,000 in 2019, down by $40,000 today. 4. Qatar. Despite the recent surge, oil prices have in general suffered from a steady and sometimes dramatic decline since the mid-2010s. The per capita GDP of a Qatari citizen was over $143,222 in 2014, it was just $97,846 a year later, and to this day it remains closer to this level than to its highs. Still, the country's oil, gas and petrochemical reserves are so large, and its population so small, just 2.8 million, that this marvel of ultra-modern architecture, luxury shopping malls and fine cuisine has managed to top the list of the world's richest nations for 20 years. Yet, with only about 12% of the residents being Qatari nationals, in the initial months of the pandemic the country, similarly to many other Gulf states, saw COVID-19 spreading especially among low-income migrant workers living in crowded quarters at furious speed. Quarantines, curfews and lockdowns have been imposed more than once, yet Qatar suffered one of the highest rates of positive cases in the region. 3. Ireland. Until recently, Ireland seemed unstoppable. While the rest of Europe was facing all sorts of uncertainties, Brexit, trade tensions with the US, refugee and migrant crises to name a few, the Irish economy was humming along. In 2019, when the Eurozone grew only 1.5%, it expanded by over 4.9%, the fastest growing country in the bloc. It would only be normal to think that COVID changed that, right? But Ireland defied all expectations once again. Its GDP grew by 5.8% in 2020, and by more than twice that, meaning an astounding 13%, in 2021. Forecasts for 2022 are somewhat more conservative, standing at about 5.2%, although most nations can only dream of achieving such a level of growth. A nation of just 5 million inhabitants, Ireland was one of the hardest hit by the 2008 financial crisis. Following some politically difficult reform measures like deep cuts to public sector wages and restructuring its banking industry, the island nation regained its fiscal health, boosted its employment rates and saw its per capita GDP almost double in a short amount of time. 2. Singapore. With an estimated net worth of $23 billion, restaurateur Zhang Yong is the richest person living in Singapore. In second place with assets of about $20 billion, to some people's surprise, is Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, who in 2011 left the US with 53 million shares of the company and became a permanent resident of the island nation. Saverin did not choose it just for its urban attractions or natural gateways. Singapore is an affluent fiscal haven where capital gains and dividends are tax-free. 1. Luxembourg. You can visit Luxembourg for its castles and beautiful countryside, its cultural festivals or gastronomic specialties. Or you could just set up an offshore account through one of its banks and never set foot again, as many do. Luxembourg uses a large share of its wealth to deliver better housing, healthcare and education to its people, who by far enjoy the highest standard of living in the Eurozone. That's it from today's video. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the video. See you next time.